Waka everyone and welcome to the No Clue Crew, where we explore fascinating moments in history. I'm Trenton and my co-hosts are Megan and Katherine. Today we will be diving into the story of the role of key figures during the beginning of the Cold War. Before we go on, please like and subscribe to this channel.
Today we're going to explore the figures that shaped the beginning of the Cold War, a crucial moment in history that changed the course of the world. So tell me, Megan, what were the beginning stages of the Cold War?
As World War II transformed both the United States and the USSR, turning the nations into alarming world powers, the competition between the two increased following the defeat of Axis powers, and ideology and political rivalry between the United States and the USSR gave the way to start of the Cold War.
A series of events in the late 1940s led to, in June 1950, the first military action of the Cold War began when the Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded its pro-Western neighbor to the south. A lot of American officials got scared because this was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world, and found that ignoring it was not an option.
You may be wondering which countries were affected by the Cold War. Let's find out. The Cold War affected countries in Europe in a lot of ways. Western Europe received aid from the US, while Eastern Europe had communism imposed on it and was under the strong influence of the Soviet Union.
How did Europe handle the Cold War? The Western Europe allied with the US, while Eastern Europe allied with the Soviet Union. Western Europe received martial air and joined the defensive alliance with NATO. Eastern Europe had limited independence in the Soviet Union, and they created their own military alliance with the Warsaw Pact and Economic Union with Comecon.
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was founded in 1949 to serve as a defensive alliance against possible Soviet aggression in Europe. Warsaw Pact definition is after West Germany joined NATO in 1955. The communist countries responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, their own defensive alliance. Comcon's definition is the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance of Comcon was created in 1949 as to promote economic cooperation between the communist country.
The US-Soviet Cold War had very perilous consequences, putting the world on the brink of nuclear war in instances such as the Berlin Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did the different ideologies of Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin influence their respective foreign policies? And what were the subsequent effects on global political alliances during the early Cold War?
Stalin's foreign policy in World War II was to expand the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe. Stalin feared that Eastern Europe was the doorway for an attack on the Soviet Union by the West. Examples of when he took over Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany. An example of the Soviet expansion is in 1945. East Germany was part of a Soviet zone of occupation, so they set up a communist government.
Another example is in 1947 Poland. Stalin invited 16 non-communist politicians to Moscow, where they went to jail. With their political opponents removed, the Polish communists won the election. And the last example is in 1948, Czechoslovakia was the last country to fully fall to communism, and that year only communists were allowed to stand and the communist government was duly elected.
The US wanted to contain communism because it would threaten their freedoms, their individuality, and their way of living. In what ways did Winston Churchill's interpretation of the post-World War II landscape reflect his view on democracy and totalitarianism? And how did this perspective impact the strategies employed by Western nations in their dealings with the Soviet Union?
Churchill saw the victory as an achievement that surrendered disaster. In Europe, the Allies won against Nazi tyranny. However, another brutal oppression now controlled Eastern Europe. World War II started with Germany trying to take Poland and ended with Russia doing so.
Churchill's 1946 speech in Missouri connected the anti-Soviet perspective that Eastern Europe was controlled by the Soviet Union. It helped support American and Western European opposition to communism and the Soviet Union.
To what extent did the military decisions made by key leaders during the early Cold War, such as the establishment of NATO by Truman and Stalin's response through the Warsaw Pact, define the economic conditions and power dynamics of Europe in the following decades? During the war, the United States, Great Britain, France, and other countries came together and were talking. Then the Soviet Union began, and as the guns fell silent at the end of World War II, the USSR installed pro-Soviet governments in the area to watch out for what would happen again and had taken in the Nazis during the war. In 1947, the U.S. leader became friendly to the nations and helped them rebuild their war damaged. The following year, the American leader adopted the militaristic stand towards the Soviets.
Czechoslovakia and brought that nation firmly into the communist camp. Within a few days, the U.S. leaders agreed to join discussions aimed at forming a joint security agreement with their European allies. In 1949, Europe gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. When the U.S. Secretary of State put his signature on the document, they reflected an important change. NATO formed the backbone of West's military bulwark against the USSR and its allies for the next 40 years, with membership growing larger over the course of the Cold War era.
So to recap, the Cold War was a turning point because it shook the foundation of the world, as it was the first time that large-scale nuclear warfare became a truly realistic threat. Conflicts connected to the Cold War, such as wars in Korea and Vietnam, proved devastating to military forces on both sides. These conflicts also disrupted the balance of power in several regions across the globe, the ramifications of which continue to influence military and national security policies to this day.
The Cold War affected domestic policy in two ways, socially and economically. The intensive indoctrination of the American people led to a regression of social reforms, especially regarding civil rights, labor unions, working conditions, and women's concerns.
So tell me, Trenton, what do you think would have happened if the Cold War had never taken place?
I think if the Cold War had never happened, the world would be a really different place with likely less global tension, a lot less nuclear arsenal, and different political landscapes across the world. The countries in Europe would have been impacted the most if the Cold War had never happened. I think the world would be in danger because starvation would have happened if there weren't good coming into the United States.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Jack Patke for more deep dives into history. Feel free to share your thoughts with us on Facebook or YouTube.
Until next time, my fellow natives, keep exploring the past to understand the present.